The story began in the quiet suburbs of a lakeside neighborhood. It was the sort of place where residents expected tranquility, where the sound of birds carried across calm waters, and where evening walks by the shore gave the illusion of peace. Yet beneath that surface, beauty simmered something darker, an HOA board notorious for its arrogance, its overreach, and its endless appetite for control. For years, the association ruled with iron hands disguised as neighborly smiles. Fines were handed out for lawns half an inch too tall, for mailboxes that strayed from the approved color chart, even for seasonal decorations taken down a day too late. To new homeowners, the rules seemed absurd, but those who resisted quickly learned that the HOA never backed down. They didn't just enforce regulations, they weaponized them. The central figure of this story, a man named Daniel, had bought a property in this neighborhood not long ago. Unlike most, Daniel hadn't purchased the home because of the HOA standards or promises of community order. His true interest lay in the lake that bordered his property. Fishing was his passion, his way of unwinding, and the lake provided that rare gift. But what Daniel didn't realize was that the HOA considered the lake their domain, a jewel they believed they alone controlled. The trouble started one summer afternoon when Daniel received a letter in the mail. Inside was a neatly folded sheet of paper embossed with the HOA letterhead. The message was short and smug. He had been fined for unauthorized use of community property. The violation: fishing from the lake behind his own home. At first, Daniel assumed it was some clerical mistake. After all, his property deed clearly showed access to that stretch of the water. But the HOA insisted otherwise, declaring that all rights to the lake belonged exclusively to them, and that residents required special permission granted only at the whim of the board. For most people, this would have been the end of it. Pay the fine, avoid the fight, and move on. That's what the HOA expected, but Daniel wasn't most people. Instead of writing a check, he began digging into the documents, researching not just his deed but the history of the lake and the neighborhood itself. And what he uncovered shocked him. Decades earlier, long before the HOA was formed, the land had been divided and sold to private buyers. The lake, though shared, had been carved into separate ownership parcels. Each property line extended into the water, granting homeowners individual rights. Somewhere along the way, the HOA had simply ignored that truth, enforcing rules over property they didn't actually own. Daniel discovered something even more startling. The HOA-owned clubhouse, the building they proudly called their headquarters, sat partially on land included in his deed. Due to a decade-old surveying error that was never corrected, Daniel legally owned not just a slice of the shoreline, but a significant portion of the very ground beneath the HOA feet. Armed with this knowledge, he chose not to confront them directly, at least not yet. Instead, he continued fishing from his dock, ignoring the fines as they piled up. The HOA grew increasingly hostile, escalating their threats. Letters became warnings, warnings became demands, and soon Daniel was informed that his continued defiance could result in legal action. But then came the turning point. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the trees, an HOA board member spotted Daniel casting his line into the water. Furious, they dialed 911, reporting him for trespassing. Sirens echoed down the quiet streets, shattering the illusion of suburban calm. Neighbors peeked from behind curtains as police cars arrived, lights flashing. The HOA board waited smugly, believing they had finally cornered him. Yet when officers examined Daniel's paperwork, the narrative began to crumble. They saw the deed, the survey lines, the irrefutable evidence that the HOA had no claim over his section of the lake. What was meant to be Daniel's public humiliation turned instead into the HOA's first crack of exposure. But this was only the beginning, because while Daniel had proven his right to fish, he had not yet revealed his greatest discovery: the ownership of the land beneath the HOA prized clubhouse. That revelation, when it came, would turn the entire neighborhood upside down. The HOA thought they had silenced one man. What they didn't know was that he now held the power to silence them all. And so, while the police cars drove away that night and the lake returned to its peaceful stillness, the seeds of a much larger battle had already been planted. Daniel knew the storm was coming. The HOA, however, remained blissfully unaware of just how close they were to losing everything. The stage was set. What began as a fine over fishing would soon escalate into a fight that would banish the HOA forever. The real war had only just begun. The fallout from that evening spread like wildfire through the neighborhood. Residents whispered about what they had seen: squad cars, flashing lights, and the HOA board standing stiff with indignation as the police left without arresting Daniel. The incident left a crack in the association's aura of authority. For years, their threats had been enough to scare homeowners into obedience. But now, for the first time, someone had openly resisted, and won. The board, humiliated, couldn't let it go. They doubled down, believing that crushing Daniel was the only way to preserve their control. Within days, new letters flooded his mailbox. The tone grew sharper, the fees more outrageous. Each envelope was padded with threats of liens, lawsuits, and property seizure. Their tactic was clear. If intimidation didn't work, financial strangulation would. Meanwhile, Daniel quietly watched it all unfold, refusing to react. He knew something the board didn't. Their power rested on a foundation of fear and ignorance, not legality, and soon their own arrogance would serve as the weapon that destroyed them. Behind the scenes, the HOA board members convened frantic meetings in their prized clubhouse. That two-story brick building they proudly displayed as proof of their influence. They schemed about legal maneuvers, about calling special votes, about how to publicly smear Daniel as a troublemaker. They believed they had home field advantage, but what they failed to realize was that the very building where they plotted their retaliation wasn't truly theirs to begin with. Daniel spent his nights combing through property records, pulling copies of plats, deeds, and survey maps. The more he uncovered, the more glaring the HOA lies became. Not only did he own rights to fish in his section of the lake, but his deed extended into land the HOA had treated as common property for decades. The boundaries weren't vague, nor were they negotiable. They were legal, recorded, and enforceable. Still, Daniel held his silence. He knew the HOA pride would force them to push harder, and push they did. Soon, a certified letter arrived declaring that he owed thousands of dollars in accumulated fines. The letter warned that if he failed to pay, a lien would be placed against his property. The board expected panic. They expected Daniel to cave, as countless others had before him. Instead, he smiled, because Daniel also knew something else about liens. When filed improperly, they became grounds for counterclaims. And given the HOA weak legal standing, this was a trap they were walking straight into. Yet it wasn't only about money anymore. The HOA actions had drawn the attention of the wider neighborhood. Other residents, long silent under the board's watchful eye, began to question the legitimacy of their fines. If Daniel could resist, why couldn't they? And if the HOA had overreached in his case, how many others had been wronged as well? Tension simmered in the air. Neighbors gathered in hushed groups, wondering how far the conflict would go. The board, sensing its slipping grip, became more aggressive, prowling the streets, scrutinizing every yard, every car, every window blind left open at the wrong angle. They issued citations for trivialities, hoping to reassert dominance. But each action only fueled resentment. Daniel remained patient, almost unnervingly calm. He didn't fight the HOA in their petty skirmishes. He let them throw every dart they had, all the while knowing their most prized possession, the clubhouse, was already his. The irony wasn't lost on him. Every board meeting, every hostile letter, every vote they held beneath that roof, all of it was happening on land he legally owned. The breaking point came one morning when the HOA posted a notice on his front door. Bold red letters screamed final warning. The message declared that if Daniel continued to trespass on the lake, they would pursue immediate legal action. They gave him 30 days to comply. What they didn't realize was that by putting their threat in writing, they had handed Daniel the final piece of evidence he needed. Their false claim of ownership, their attempt to enforce rules on land outside their control, and their repeated fines, all of it painted a picture of abuse, intimidation, and fraud. Daniel now had everything: the deeds, the maps, the proof of ownership, and their own words incriminating them. The trap was set, All that remained was to spring it, but instead of confronting them directly, Daniel decided to take a more calculated approach. He began quietly reaching out to neighbors, sharing portions of what he had uncovered. He didn't reveal the full scope, not yet, but enough to plant seeds of doubt, enough to show them that the HOA power wasn't absolute. And as those seeds took root, Daniel prepared for the moment when he would reveal the truth in its entirety. The moment when the HOA would realize the land they stood on, quite literally, was never theirs to claim. The 30-day deadline loomed. The board believed it was counting down to Daniel's defeat, but in reality, the clock was ticking on their own downfall. The calm before the storm was almost over. The 30 days passed in tense silence. To the HOA, it felt like a countdown to victory. They watched Daniel with hawk-like eyes, waiting for the slightest misstep. They assumed his calm demeanor was a mask, a desperate attempt to hide his fear. They didn't realize it wasn't fear at all, but calculation. Daniel let them stew in their arrogance. He continued his normal life, fishing from his dock, maintaining his property, and ignoring their mounting fines. Each action enraged the board. Each cast of his fishing line felt like an act of rebellion. To them, Daniel was a symbol of everything that threatened their control. They needed to make an example of him. Behind the scenes, they prepared their case. They drafted legal notices, planned to file liens, and even whispered about suing him for damages. In their minds, this would end swiftly and decisively. But while they sharpened their knives, Daniel was forging a sword. It happened one crisp morning, when the sun reflected off the lake like a sheet of glass. Daniel walked down to the courthouse with a folder tucked beneath his arm. Inside were copies of his deed, property maps, surveys, and the HOA-owned threatening letters. He didn't go to argue, he went to file. What he placed on record that day was more than paperwork. It was a declaration. The file showed in black and white that Daniel not only owned his stretch of the lake, but also a significant portion of the land beneath the HOA clubhouse. Due to an overlooked surveying error decades earlier, the board had been occupying property that was legally his. Every meeting they had held, every decision they had made, every document signed inside that building had been conducted on land they did not rightfully own. The clerk stamped the papers, and with that, the fuse was lit. Word spread quickly, as it always does in tight-knit neighborhoods. At first, it was disbelief. The idea that the HOA fortress of authority, their clubhouse, wasn't truly theirs seemed impossible. But then residents began seeing the documents themselves. They saw the surveys, the maps, the signatures. The truth was undeniable. The HOA board scrambled to respond. They called an emergency meeting, one that was meant to project strength. But the very walls around them betrayed them. Daniel arrived not to speak, but simply to stand outside with a quiet smile, holding a stack of copies for any curious neighbor who passed. Residents trickled over, taking papers, reading the evidence with wide eyes. The board inside could hear the murmur of voices growing louder. Their fortress was crumbling from within. For years, the HOA had hidden behind threats and intimidation. But now, exposed under the harsh light of truth, their authority looked flimsy. If they couldn't even prove ownership of the land beneath their feet, how could they claim dominion over the lake, or the lawns, or the mailboxes? The more the neighbors learned, the more emboldened they became. Some remembered arbitrary fines they had paid, wondering if they'd been victims of fraud. Others recalled the humiliating letters, the threats, the fear of liens, and all of them began asking the same question. If Daniel could stand against the HOA, why couldn't they? The board tried to fight back, but their attempts only deepened the hole they were in. They insisted the surveys were wrong, that the deeds were outdated, that Daniel was twisting the facts. But every denial was met with more evidence, more paperwork, more proof. The harder they pushed, the weaker they looked. Tension reached a boiling point when Daniel revealed his next move. He filed notice that the HOA was trespassing on his property. Their beloved clubhouse, the stage for all their arrogance, was officially under dispute. If they refused to acknowledge his ownership, he could, by law, bar them from entering it altogether. The board panicked. Without the clubhouse, their power had no stage, their meetings would scatter. Their image of legitimacy would vanish. It wasn't just a building, it was the symbol of everything they claimed to be, and now it was slipping from their grasp. As days passed, the balance of power shifted dramatically. Neighbors who had once cowered under the HOA threats now stood taller, emboldened by Daniel's example. Conversations turned into whispers, whispers into planning. Talk of dissolving the HOA altogether began to surface, spoken with a mixture of excitement and fear. For the first time, the board wasn't feared. They were pitied. Their frantic actions, their desperate letters, their clumsy denials all revealed the truth. The empire they built was crumbling. But Daniel wasn't finished. He knew the HOA would fight until their last breath, clawing for every scrap of authority. And so he prepared for the next stage, not just exposing their lies, but dismantling the very structure of their power. The board thought they had cornered him with threats of liens and lawsuits, but Daniel now held the ultimate counter. Not only could he fight back, he could strip them of everything. The calm before the storm was ending. The real battle for control was about to begin. The moment Daniel's trespass filing became public, the HOA veneer of control cracked wide open. What had once been whispered rumors among neighbors turned into open conversations on driveways, sidewalks, and over back fences. The residents no longer spoke in hushed tones, but with boldness. The board's authority was no longer absolute. For years, fear had been their strongest weapon. The threat of liens, the intimidation of letters, the embarrassment of being called out in meetings, all of it kept homeowners obedient. But fear only works as long as people believe in the illusion of power, and now the illusion had shattered. The clubhouse stood at the center of the storm. It wasn't just a building anymore, it was a monument to the HOA arrogance, a daily reminder of their control. But as the neighbors learned that the very ground beneath it was not theirs to claim, the symbolism shifted. To the board, it was a fortress. To the residents, it became a fraud. The board fought desperately to hold on. They plastered the neighborhood with flyers claiming Daniel's documents were forged. They called for emergency dues to fund a legal defense, insisting that the association's survival was at stake. But each move backfired. Residents questioned why their money should defend a building the HOA didn't even own. Some refused to pay at all, openly challenging the authority they once feared. The louder the board shouted, the weaker they looked. Meetings devolved into chaos as angry homeowners demanded answers. Why had they been fined for lake access Daniel clearly owned? Why had dues been raised year after year if the HOA foundation was built on lies? Why had no one on the board bothered to verify ownership of the clubhouse land? For the first time, the board had no answers. Their smug confidence melted into flustered excuses, their arrogance into stumbling denial. The once proud leaders were reduced to cornered figures, clinging to scraps of credibility. Meanwhile, Daniel's calm presence fueled the residents' courage. He didn't need to scream or argue. He simply provided evidence, documents, maps, surveys, handed out quietly, almost casually. His silence spoke louder than their noise. Every page he shared widened the cracks in the HOA crumbling authority. The board tried to retaliate one last time, filing a lien against Daniel's property. It was their signature move, the weapon they'd used to keep countless homeowners in line. But this time it backfired spectacularly. Daniel filed a counterclaim, not only challenging the lien but accusing the HOA of harassment and fraudulent enforcement. His case didn't just protect himself, it opened the door for other residents to question the validity of every fine, every lien, every demand the board had ever issued. The legal pressure was suffocating. Board members who once thrived on control now faced the real possibility of personal liability. Their names, attached to years of abusive enforcement, could drag them into court. The thought of losing not just their titles but their savings, their reputations, their freedom, it was more than they could bear. Some cracked under the strain. A few quietly resigned, slipping away before the storm grew worse. Others clung tighter, doubling down on their rhetoric, insisting that they were victims of a smear campaign. But their defiance rang hollow. The neighborhood no longer listened. The residents, once divided by fear, now united in anger. They began to organize, meeting in living rooms and backyards away from the HOA grasp. Talk turned into action, petitions circulated, signatures collected, votes planned. The idea that once seemed impossible, dissolving the HOA, was now a shared goal. The board could feel the ground shifting beneath them, both literally and figuratively. The clubhouse they held meetings in was contested property. The residents who once obeyed now openly defied. The power they once wielded so carelessly was evaporating. And the man they had tried to crush stood taller than ever, his quiet strength dismantling their empire piece by piece. Then came the final blow. The county confirmed Daniel's claim. Official records were updated, marking the disputed land as his property. The HOA last defense crumbled. Their clubhouse, their pride, their symbol of power, it was gone. The announcement rippled through the neighborhood like an earthquake. Some residents cheered openly, celebrating the end of the board's stranglehold. Others stood in stunned silence, realizing just how deeply they had been misled. But everyone knew the truth. The HOA reign was over. The board, once untouchable, was now nothing more than a handful of neighbors with no authority, no clubhouse, and no credibility. Their downfall was complete, but the story didn't end there. Because while the HOA had been stripped of power, questions remained. What would become of the neighborhood now? Who would step up to fill the void? And how far would the board go in their final desperate attempts to cling to what little they had left? The battle was ending, but the reckoning was only beginning. The HOA empire was shattered, but pride is a stubborn thing. Even stripped of their clubhouse, even with residents abandoning them, the board refused to accept defeat. They clung to what scraps of authority they believed remained, determined to fight until the very end. Their last hope was the courts. Convinced they could salvage control through sheer aggression, the board pooled what was left of their dwindling funds and filed a lawsuit against Daniel. Their claim was wild, desperate, and riddled with contradictions. They accused him of fraud, of falsifying documents, of conspiring against the association. It was less a legal strategy than a tantrum written on paper, but to the board it felt like their final chance. Daniel, however, was ready. Every piece of evidence they threw at him only bounced back harder. He produced certified surveys, notarized deeds, official county filings, all of it irrefutable. Where the board had bluster, Daniel had facts. And in a courtroom, facts carried weight. The lawsuit that was meant to silence him instead magnified the HOA corruption. Each hearing exposed more of their misdeeds, the fines levied without cause, the liens filed without legal backing, the intimidation tactics they had wielded against countless homeowners. Residents who had once kept quiet now stepped forward, sharing their stories of harassment, their anger spilling into sworn testimonies. The court became a stage not for the HOA redemption, but for their humiliation. Piece by piece, their credibility disintegrated. Judges frowned at their baseless claims. Attorneys shook their heads at their incompetence. What was meant to be Daniel's downfall became the HOA public unmasking. Outside the courtroom, the neighborhood transformed. Freed from fear, residents began reclaiming their independence. No longer burdened by fines or threats, they painted their mailboxes however they pleased, landscaped their yards to their own taste, decorated their homes without restriction. The artificial uniformity the HOA once demanded dissolved, replaced by something far more powerful, individuality. The board, watching this rebellion, grew frantic. They bombarded residents with letters demanding dues, but most went unpaid. They tried organizing meetings, but no one showed. They plastered the neighborhood with flyers filled with threats, but residents tore them down within hours. Their power had become a joke, their name a curse whispered with disdain. Still, they refused to stop. Pride and desperation drove them forward, even as the ground crumbled beneath their feet. They borrowed money, they begged for donations, they promised that one more lawsuit, one more filing, one more desperate push would restore their control. But it never did. Each move only deepened their debt, widened their humiliation, and hastened their collapse. Meanwhile, Daniel remained steady. He didn't gloat, didn't mock, didn't stoop to their level. He simply continued presenting evidence, defending himself with calm precision. His composure only highlighted the board's chaos. He became not just a homeowner, but a symbol of resistance. To the residents, he wasn't merely the man who exposed the HOA. He was the man who freed them. As the court case dragged on, the final blow landed. The judge dismissed the HOA lawsuit, citing lack of evidence and abuse of process. Worse for the board, they were ordered to pay Daniel's legal fees. It was a devastating ruling. Not only had they failed to defeat him, but they had bankrupted themselves in the process. The board dissolved soon after, its members scattering like leaves in the wind. Some resigned quietly, slipping into obscurity. Others moved away altogether, unable to face the shame. A few clung bitterly to their victim narrative, but no one listened anymore. Their reign of intimidation was over. The neighborhood stood free. The lake sparkled in the sunlight, unburdened by false claims of ownership. The clubhouse, now legally Daniel's, stood as a monument not to the HOA power, but to its downfall. The residents who once cowered beneath the board's shadow now walked taller, their voices louder, their homes their own once more. But while the HOA was gone, its shadow lingered. Memories of years of harassment, of money stolen, of humiliation endured. They would not vanish overnight. The scars remained, etched into the collective memory of the neighborhood, and Daniel knew that while the battle had been won, the true healing had only just begun. Still, the board wasn't completely finished. Even in defeat, there were whispers of one final act, one last desperate attempt to claw back a shred of dignity. Whether through backdoor deals, hidden schemes, or sheer spite, the remnants of the HOA weren't ready to disappear quietly. The residents prepared for whatever came next, united in a way they had never been before. For the first time in years, they were no longer ruled by fear, but by strength. And at the center of it all stood Daniel, the man who had turned a fishing fine into a revolution. The final chapter of this saga was about to be written. The lawsuit's dismissal should have been the end. With their claims crushed, their money drained, and their reputation destroyed, the HOA had nothing left to stand on. But pride is a dangerous thing, and the remnants of the board still believed they could claw their way back. They tried one last trick. Quietly, they petitioned the county, arguing that Daniel's land ownership created a public hazard. They claimed the neighborhood needed the HOA for safety and order. They even attempted to rally outside support, painting Daniel as a selfish troublemaker who threatened community harmony. It was their final card, their last-ditch hope that someone, somewhere, would hand them back the authority they had lost. But this time, the residents were ready. No one believed the board's cries of victimhood. Instead, dozens of homeowners stepped forward with statements of their own, recounting years of abuse, the unfair fines, the harassing letters, the threats of liens. Their testimonies painted a clear picture, not of a benevolent association, but of a corrupt machine that had exploited its power for too long. The county listened, and the decision was swift. The HOA petition was denied. Worse for the board, their pattern of harassment and fraudulent enforcement was formally recognized. The ruling declared that the HOA had no standing to govern the neighborhood. They were stripped of any legal authority, their charter voided, their power permanently dissolved. In one stroke, the HOA wasn't just weakened, it was banned. The announcement sent shockwaves through the community. For years, the board had presented themselves as untouchable, the guardians of order, the rulers of every lawn and mailbox. And now they were nothing. The residents celebrated, their cheers echoing across the lake that had sparked the entire battle. For the first time in decades, they were free. The clubhouse, standing silent and empty, became the symbol of the victory. Daniel, now its rightful owner, refused to turn it into a monument to himself. Instead, he offered the space back to the community, not as a headquarters of control, but as a gathering place of choice. Residents used it for barbecues, birthday parties, and holiday events. The building that once represented oppression was reborn as a symbol of unity. Daniel's victory spread beyond the neighborhood. Stories of his fight traveled across the county, then across the state, resonating with homeowners who had endured similar battles. He became a quiet hero in a growing movement against abusive HOA. His name shared in forums, his story retold in living rooms and town halls. Yet for Daniel, the victory was personal. What began as a simple love of fishing had turned into a war he never asked for. He hadn't sought power, only peace. But in standing his ground, he had uncovered corruption, dismantled an empire of fear, and given his neighbors the gift of freedom. The former board members faded into obscurity. Some moved away in shame, their names forever tied to the failed regime. Others lingered, bitter but powerless, their threats now empty words. The residents who once trembled before them now ignored them with ease. They were relics of a system that no longer existed. Life by the lake returned to what it should have always been: peaceful. Children played along the shore, families gathered on their porches, and neighbors spoke freely without fear of citation. The air felt lighter, as if the entire community had taken a collective breath after years of suffocation. In the evenings, Daniel often sat on his dock, casting his line into the water. The lake was calm, its surface reflecting the sky, no longer a battlefield, but a sanctuary once more. He thought of everything that had happened: the fines, the flashing lights of police cars, the clubhouse dispute, the courtroom battles, and marveled at how something so small had grown into something so monumental. The HOA had tried to destroy him, but in the end they had destroyed themselves. Their greed, their arrogance, their hunger for control had blinded them to the truth. And the truth was simple: people will only live in fear for so long. Sooner or later, someone will stand up. Daniel had been that someone, and because of it, the HOA was gone. Forever.